I'm supposed to talk about it now. They say it's been long enough. It's the day I didn't kneel. That's how everyone remembers it. But that's not what it was about. And what happens when one person stands when everyone else is on their knees. Before that day, I was no one important. My name was Lysandra Kyle, but it was just a name on a page. I worked in the Imperial archives. I read old laws, old histories. That was my life. I understood the rules. I knew the protocol better than most. I believed in the structure of it all. The injustice wasn't new. It was a tax, a small one, but it was wrong. It targeted families who had already lost everything in the border skirmishes. It was a cruel, petty line item in a budget, and I knew the law it violated. I had read the original charter myself, so I wrote a petition. That's all it was, a carefully worded document citing precedent and imperial law. I believed the system would listen to its own rules. I thought if I just pointed it out, calmly and correctly, someone would fix the mistake. I wasn't trying to start a rebellion. I was just trying to get a tax repealed. I sent it through the proper channels. I followed every step. I was just pointing out an error. My petition was received. That's the official term. It means it was filed away to be forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten. Someone with a grudge, or maybe someone who was just bored, passed it up the chain. It landed on a desk where it shouldn't have. And then the summons came. Not a letter of dismissal, not a quiet warning, a formal summons to the throne hall for a public audience. I knew what that meant. This wasn't about the tax anymore. It wasn't about the families. It was about me. About making an example of someone who dared to use the emperor's own laws to question a decree. My friends, the few I had, they told me to be sensible, to go, to kneel, to apologize for the misunderstanding. They told me it was just a gesture, a performance, that it meant nothing. But I had read the histories. I knew what the kneeling meant. It wasn't just a gesture, it was an agreement, it was a retraction. It meant that what I wrote was a lie. It meant the injustice was not an injustice. It meant I was wrong, and I wasn't wrong. The law was clear, the suffering was real. So I went to the throne hall. I knew what they wanted, and I knew I couldn't give it to them. I wasn't trying to be a hero, I just couldn't lie. Not like that. Not with my whole body. The day came. I went. I remember the feeling of just walking, one foot in front of the other. The hall was full. All the important people were there. Generals, priests, nobles, scribes, everyone. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that's full of noise. The sound of people waiting for something to happen. My name was called. I walked forward. I stopped at the designated spot on the floor. I knew where it was. I had read the books on protocol. Then the command came, the official order, to kneel. It was simple, absolute. Everyone was watching. The scribes had their pens ready. The guards were watching me. The whole court was watching me. And I just stood there. I didn't say anything. I didn't shake my head. I didn't make a face. I just stood. It felt like a very, very long time. The silence got heavier. I could feel the question in the air, from hundreds of people at once. The guards tensed. I saw it. They were waiting for a different order, the order to force me down. The scribes hesitated. I could see them from the corner of my eye. Their hands were frozen. What do you write? The defiance or the punishment that was supposed to follow instantly? This was the moment it should have ended for me. A quick, brutal lesson? But it didn't, because the emperor did something else. He stood up. The whole room seemed to stop breathing. An emperor does not leave the throne during a public audience. Ever. It has never happened. He didn't rush. He just descended, step by step. He closed the distance between us, the space that was supposed to separate him from everyone else. He wasn't angry. He wasn't anything. His face was just calm. He stopped right in front of me. We were at the same level, eye to eye. The ritual was broken, not by me, but by him. My refusal was a crack in the ice. His dissent was the thing that shattered it completely. Authority wasn't up there anymore. It was right here, in front of me, close enough to touch. The court was in shock. This was worse than my defiance. This was a violation of centuries of tradition. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at me, and the whole empire held its breath. I wasn't executed. I wasn't thrown in a cell. I was detained. It's a strange word. It means you aren't free, but you aren't a prisoner either. I was given rooms within the palace. I was fed. I was not harmed. But I couldn't leave. I became a problem that had no name. The court didn't know what to do. The emperor had broken his own ritual. To punish me now would be to admit he had made a mistake by stepping down. To release me would be to admit I had won. So I just existed. A ghost in the palace. A political liability. The first time he came to see me, it was a few days later. He came alone. No guards, no scribes. It was just the two of us in a room. He didn't sit on a high-backed chair. He just stood. I stood. It felt like we were continuing the moment from the throne hall. He didn't shout. He was very calm. He explained the purpose of the ritual, the need for the kneeling. He said it wasn't about him. It was about the empire. That the throne's power came from that distance, from that symbolic submission. He told me that millions of people's lives depended on that stability, on everyone agreeing to the same symbols, the same rules. He said when I refused to kneel, I wasn't defying a man. I was threatening the foundation of the entire imperial structure. I listened. I understood what he was saying. I had read the same books he had. Then I explained my side. I told him I could not perform an act of submission that was based on a lie. I told him kneeling would have been an endorsement of the unjust tax. It would have been a public declaration that the suffering of those families didn't matter. I told him my body would have been used to legitimize a wrong, and that was a price I wasn't willing to pay. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't an argument. It was two people stating their positions. Both of us understood the other perfectly, and neither of us would yield. He left, and I was still there, still detained. We had more of these conversations, always in private, always just the two of us. He would explain the practicalities of power, how ritual keeps the peace, how the image of the emperor is more important than the man. I would explain the principle, how a system that requires lies to function is already broken. We were never angry. The talks were always quiet, precise, tense. He was trying to understand me. I was trying to understand him. I realized he wasn't a tyrant. He was a man trapped in a role, a man who inherited a machine and was trying to keep it running. He saw my refusal not as an act of conscience, but as a wrench thrown into the gears. And I saw his insistence not as cruelty, but as a desperate attempt to prevent a collapse that he believed would be catastrophic for everyone. During one of these talks, something shifted. He was talking about the throne, about the distance it created. And then he stopped. He looked away for a moment. He said, "The throne exists to preserve that distance, not to find truth." It was a quiet admission, a fracture in the imperial facade. He was acknowledging that the entire system he was defending was not about right or wrong. It was about separation, about being above and beyond and unquestionable. In that moment, I understood him, and I think he understood me. It wasn't intimacy, it wasn't friendship, it was recognition. We both saw the trap we were in. He was trapped on the throne, and I was trapped by my refusal to kneel before it. We both knew the cost of stepping outside the ritual. He had paid it by stepping down. I was paying it by being held in this strange limbo, and we both knew it couldn't last. The court was not as patient as the emperor. Uncertainty is a poison in a place like that. My continued presence, unpunished, was making them frantic. The generals saw it as weakness. A ruler who couldn't command obedience from one unarmed woman was no ruler at all. The priests saw it as sacrilege, a violation of divine order. The nobles saw it as a dangerous precedent. If I could refuse, why not others? Why not them? They pressured him daily. They demanded a resolution. They demanded my punishment. They needed to see the old order restored. They needed to see me on my knees or dead. It didn't matter which. Both would serve the same purpose. The emperor was being pushed into a corner. He had to reassert his dominance. He had to put the power back on the throne. He came to me one last time in private. His face was tired. He looked older. He made an offer, a way out for both of us. He called it a conditional resolution. I would kneel, but in private, just him and me, no witnesses. The court would then be informed that the ritual had been completed correctly. The scribes would be ordered to amend the records. History would show obedience. The public record would be clean. My defiance would be erased. The emperor's authority would be restored. The empire would remain stable, and I would be free to go. It was a simple solution. A lie to save the system. A lie to save my life. Everyone would get what they wanted. The court would have its submission. The emperor would have his stability. I would have my freedom. He wasn't ordering me. He was asking. He just stood there, waiting for my answer. And I refused. Again, I didn't do it dramatically. I just told him. I told him that a lie recorded as truth is worse than a punishment endured for the truth. I told him that if the official history said I knelt, then the lie would live forever. My real action, the standing, would be gone. It would mean that in the end, the system that demanded the lie had won. I would not let my story be erased. He looked at me for a long time. There was no anger, just a deep, profound sadness. He nodded once, as if he had expected it, as if he knew it was the only answer I could give. And then he left. The next day, my protection was gone. The guards at my door were replaced. The food stopped being as good. The quiet respect was replaced with open contempt. The emperor had withdrawn. He had reclaimed the throne, and I was left to the court. My fate was sealed. They brought me back to the throne hall. This time, it was different. It wasn't an audience. It was a trial, a judgment. The room was full again, but the mood wasn't tension. It was satisfaction. The natural order was reasserting itself. The chief minister read the charges. Defiance of an imperial command, undermining the authority of the throne, inciting disorder. It was all very formal, very correct. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. I just stood there, waiting for the sentence. Everyone knew what it would be. The minister finished. He looked to the throne, waiting for the emperor's final word, the signal to carry out the judgment. The emperor sat there, unmoving, silent. The minister waited. The court waited, and then for the second time in his life, the emperor stood up. A gasp went through the hall. Not this, not again. He descended the steps. Again. He walked past the guards, past the ministers, past the scribes. He walked right up to me. Again. He stood in front of me, at my level. The whole court watched, horrified. He was doing it again. He was breaking the ritual again. But this time, it was worse. He turned, not to me, but to the entire hall, to the nobles and the generals and the priests. And he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the entire space. He said one sentence. He said that from this day forward, no one would be required to kneel before the throne ever again. He abolished the ritual in a single moment, with a single sentence, in front of every important person in the empire. It wasn't a resolution, it was a detonation. He didn't just break the tradition, he destroyed it, permanently. The foundation of their power, the symbol they had been so desperate to protect, was gone, wiped away by the very man it was meant to elevate. The loyalties in that room fractured. I could feel it. The shock turned to anger, to confusion, to fear. He had not just saved me, he had fundamentally altered the meaning of his own authority. He turned back to me. We were just two people standing in a room full of chaos. The trial was over. The charges were meaningless. I was still standing, and the throne was empty. The empire survived. But it was never the same. Power was no longer about elevation. It was no longer about distance and symbolic submission. It became about presence, about showing up, about looking people in the eye. It was harder. It was messier. Obedience was no longer automatic. It had to be earned every single day. Some of the old guard never forgave him. They saw it as the ultimate betrayal, the end of everything they knew. But others saw it as a new beginning, a system based not on forced gestures, but on something closer to consent. I was no longer a prisoner. I was just Lysandra Kyle, a woman who had stood up. I never knelt, not in public, not in private. I didn't have to. The emperor and I, we never became friends. The gulf between our lives was too great. But there was always that recognition between us. We had stood together in the center of a fire, and we had both been changed by it. He paid a price. He carried the weight of his decision for the rest of his life. I paid a price too. You don't do something like that and just go back to your old life. I became a symbol, a person people pointed to. It was a heavy thing to carry, but it was my truth, and it was no longer a lie. Now I know it wasn't about me. It was about a single moment that asked a question. What is power? Is it the person on the throne or the truth in the person standing before it? And for one moment in one lifetime, the answer was different. I chose to stand. And because I did, he chose to descend. The sound was the first thing. Not a gasp, not a shout, a single, sharp intake of breath from 1,000 throats at once. A sound like the world suddenly remembering it had forgotten how to breathe. It was the only sound in the great hall. Then, silence. A silence heavier than any I had ever known. A silence that was not an absence of noise, but a presence, a physical weight. In that quiet, the emperor's words still hung in the air, shimmering like heat off a summer road. This ritual is a lie. From this day forward, no one shall kneel before this throne again. Again. He had used that word. He had descended from the throne once, and now he had done it again. But this time, he had not just closed the distance between us. He had shattered it for everyone. Forever. I stood on the marble floor, my legs aching from the strain of holding my place. I had expected a judgment, banishment, execution, a quiet cell for the rest of my life. I had prepared myself for a retraction of my own life, a final liability paid for a truth I could not unsay. I had not prepared for this. He did not look at me. After making his decree, his eyes swept over the stunned faces of his court. The dukes and chancellors, the ministers and magistrates, all frozen in their seats like statues in a forgotten garden. His gaze was not triumphant. It was weary, the look of a man who had just set his own house on fire because he knew it was the only way to cleanse it. Then he simply turned. His crimson cape swirled around his ankles, the only movement in the entire hall. He walked, not back to the throne, but toward the gilded doors behind it. He did not run. He did not stride. He just walked. The sound of his boots on the dais was a slow, deliberate count, a finality. The doors closed behind him, and the silence broke. It was not a flood, but 1,000 tiny fractures. A murmur here, a choked whisper there, the rustle of silk as a duchess slumped in her chair, the sharp rap of a counselor's signet ring against a wooden armrest. It was the sound of a system trying to reboot after a catastrophic failure, the sound of a world that had lost its center of gravity. All eyes turned to me. Before, they had looked at me with scorn, with pity, with anger. Now, the looks were different. They were confused, frightened. Some were filled with a raw, naked hatred. I had not just refused to perform the ritual. I had, by standing, become the catalyst for its destruction. I was sacrilege made flesh. The captain of the Imperial Guard, the same man who had escorted me here, took a half step forward and then stopped. His hand was on the hilt of his sword, but it was a gesture of uncertainty, not threat. Protocol was his lifeblood. It was the charter for his every action. The Emperor had just burned the charter. The captain looked at me, then at the empty throne, then back at me. His face, usually a mask of stern duty, was lost. I could see the question in his eyes, the one no one dared ask aloud. What now? They did not know what to do with me. The law was clear on the punishment for defiance, but the Emperor had not issued a punishment. He had issued a revolution. The charge of sacrilege was voided by the man who was its object. My petition, the small written truth that had started it all, was now an afterthought, a footnote to a much larger story. The captain finally approached me, his footsteps hesitant on the marble. "Archivist Kyle," he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual authority. He did not know my station anymore. None of them did. I simply waited. My orders were for your detention, pending judgment. He paused. A judgment has been rendered. Of a sort? He looked around at the chaos of the court, the furious hushed arguments breaking out between factions. I have no new orders. I said nothing. My role in this was over. I had stood. That was my part. The rest was just the world reacting to a fixed point. "Come with me," he said, finally making a decision. It was not a command. It was a plea for order in a world that had none. He led me from the throne hall. No shackles this time. The two guards who fell in behind us kept their distance, their unease a palpable thing. As we walked the long corridors, servants and officials flattened themselves against the walls. They stared. They were not looking at a prisoner. They were looking at a ghost or a portent, a crack in the ice of a frozen lake. I was taken back to the same opulent rooms where I had been held. My gilded cage. The guard at the door bowed his head slightly as I entered, a gesture of confusion and respect that was more unsettling than any threat. The captain stopped at the threshold. "You will remain here for your own safety." "Am I a prisoner?" I asked. My voice was steady. It was the only thing that was. He looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted, and then he closed the door, the click of the latch softer this time, less like a lock, more like a sigh. For 2 days, I lived in that surreal limbo. The rooms were the same. The silken sheets, the polished wood, the window overlooking the silent manicured gardens. But the meaning of it all had changed. Before, it was a comfortable prison. Now, it was a crucible. I was being held not by a lock, but by the weight of what had happened. Uncertainty is a poison. The silence from the Emperor was absolute. The palace beyond my door was a hive of frantic, muffled activity. I could feel the vibrations of it through the floor, a deep hum of panic and plotting. Food was brought on silver trays by servants who would not meet my eyes. They would set it down, bow, and retreat, their silence a wall. I ate, I drank, I sat in a high-backed chair and stared at the patterns in the rug, trying to trace the lines of logic that had led from a single unjust tax to the dissolution of a 1,000-year-old ritual. I kept returning to his face, the Emperor's. In our private debates, I had seen the man behind the symbol, the man burdened by the immense grinding weight of the system he commanded. He had argued for the ritual, for the necessity of the lie. He called it stability, order, the grammar of power that held the empire together. And then he had called it a lie himself, in front of everyone. Why? Was it for me? The thought was arrogant and I dismissed it. I was not important. I was an archivist, a custodian of facts. I was the small, hard truth he could not ignore. But I was not the reason. Was it a political masterstroke? A way to break the power of his own court, who had been pressuring him for my execution? By yielding on a symbol, had he consolidated real power? Perhaps. He had thrown a wrench into the gears, and in the ensuing chaos, he might be the only one who knew how to put the machine back together in a new configuration. Or was it something else? Had my simple refusal to kneel, to perform a lie with my body, truly shown him that the foundation of his power was built on something hollow? That the distance between the throne and the floor was not a source of strength, but a fatal weakness? I did not know. The truth of his motives was a record I could not access. All I had was the fact of it. He stood, he spoke, the world changed. On the evening of the 3rd day, there was a sharp knock on the door, not the soft rap of a servant. I stood. It was becoming a habit. The door opened to reveal a man I recognized from the public audiences. Lord Chancellor Valerius. His face was a mask of cold fury, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. He was the architect of Imperial protocol, the high priest of the very ritual the Emperor had just dismantled. He looked at me as if I were a disease. "Archivist Kale," he said. The title was an insult on his tongue. He stepped inside, holding a rolled scroll tied with a black ribbon. "I am here to deliver the official decree regarding your status." He did not wait for a reply. He unrolled the scroll with a snap. "By order of His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor, all charges of sacrilege and public defiance against the person of Lysandra Kale are hereby declared null and void. The conditional resolution for your petition is affirmed. Your person is declared free of all imperial liability. You are at liberty to depart." He read the words as if they were poison in his mouth. He was the system, and I had broken it. He rolled the scroll back up and held it out to me. A historical document, the first of its kind, a retraction of imperial judgment without a retraction of the offending act. I took the scroll. My hand was steady. The Chancellor's eyes narrowed. "Do not mistake this for a victory," he hissed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Emperor may have indulged this madness, but the Empire is more than one man. It is a structure. It is a foundation. You have put a crack in it, archivist, and foundations, once cracked, have a way of collapsing on those who stand too close." He was talking about the lie he needed to survive. "The Emperor is the law, Lord Chancellor," I said, my voice quiet. A flicker of something, pure hatred, crossed his face. "The Emperor is a man, and men can make mistakes. This mistake will have consequences. For all of us." He turned on his heel and left, the door closing with a sharp, definitive click. I was alone again. I looked down at the scroll in my hand. A formal decree. My freedom written in cold, precise ink. I walked to the window and looked out at the palace grounds. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the perfect lawns. I could walk out that door. I could leave this palace and return to my life. But it was a lie. The life I had was gone. The quiet anonymity of the archives, the simple pleasure of a fact correctly recorded. It was all gone. The Chancellor was wrong. I had not cracked the foundation. The Emperor had. But I had been the hammer. I was no longer Lysandra Kyle, archivist. I was the woman who refused to kneel. A symbol. And I had no idea what that symbol was supposed to do now. The sound of his footsteps faded. Then there was no sound at all. Just the sight of the heavy doors closing, the echo of their final booming clang, and the space where the Emperor had been. The throne was empty. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire court seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. They stared at the vacant seat of power, a gilded, hollow thing that had, moments before, been the center of their world. I was still standing, the lone, fixed point in a universe that had just been torn from its axis. The silence did not break. It shattered. A woman in silks of emerald green made a choked, gasping sound. A man dropped a ceremonial staff. It clattered against the marble with a noise like cracking bone. Then came the whispers, a low, sibilant tide of them, rising from every corner of the hall. Sacrilege, unprecedented, gone. Their eyes, hundreds of them, darted from the throne to me and back again. The distance between me and the dais, once a vast gulf of protocol and power, was now just empty floor. But a new distance had opened up, a chasm. On one side was the entirety of the Imperial court. On the other, there was me. And I just stood there. Lord Chancellor Valerius moved first. He seemed to gather himself, pulling the threads of his composure together with visible effort. His face was pale, his lips a thin, bloodless line. He was the living embodiment of the old guard, of the ritual that had just been dismantled. He looked at the empty throne with a kind of horrified reverence, as if gazing upon a corpse. Then he looked at me. His eyes held no confusion, only a cold, focused fury. He did not speak to me. He would not grant me that acknowledgement. Instead, he turned to the captain of the Imperial Guard, his voice a sharp, cutting thing meant to restore order. "The proceedings are concluded," Valerius declared. The words were a lie. The proceedings had not concluded. They had imploded. A matter of internal review has been initiated by the High Council concerning the Emperor's decree. Decree. He gave it the weight of law, but his tone dripped with the implication of madness. He was already trying to build a cage of words around the Emperor's action, to classify it as a temporary failure of protocol, not a permanent change in the foundation of the entire Imperial structure. The petitioner is no longer a matter of Imperial liability, he continued, his gaze finally, reluctantly falling upon me. It was a judgment, a dismissal. He was not setting me free. He was disowning me, casting me out of the system so its gears could grind on without the wrench I represented. Escort her from the palace, he commanded the guards. Not back to my gilded cage, just out. The walk from the throne hall was the inverse of my walk in. Before, I had been invisible, a minor functionary summoned for a ritual of submission. The court had been a wall of indifferent faces. Now they parted for me. They moved back as my two guards led me through the center of the hall, creating a wide, silent corridor. They stared. I could feel the weight of their attention, a physical pressure. It was not admiration. It was fear, and it was hatred. In their eyes, I was not a person who had stood for a truth. I was the reason the world had stopped making sense. I was the crack in the ice that threatened to swallow them all. I kept my eyes forward. I looked at the doors. I had wanted justice. I had wanted the retraction of an unjust tax. That was all. I had not wanted this. I had not wanted to become a symbol. But as I walked, I understood. I was no longer Lysandra Kyle, archivist. I was the woman who refused to kneel, the woman for whom the Emperor had abandoned his throne. I was an event, a piece of history that was still happening. The guards did not lead me to the main gates. They took me through a series of sterile, lesser-used corridors, the parts of the palace meant for servants and supplies. The message was clear. I was no longer a guest, honored or otherwise. I was refuse being taken out the back. They stopped at a small, unassuming door. One of the guards opened it, revealing a quiet side street, gray and empty in the fading afternoon light. "You are released," the guard said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I stepped out. The door closed behind me. I did not hear a lock turn. It did not need one. I was free, and I had never felt more like a prisoner. I did not go home. My small apartment above the scriptorium would not be safe. It was part of a life that no longer existed. It was a place Valerius would know to look. Instead, I walked. I walked until the grand marble of the Imperial district gave way to the worn cobblestones of the merchant wards, and then to the packed earth of the outer city. The news had not yet reached the streets. People went about their business. They bartered for grain, argued with neighbors, and hurried home for their evening meals. Their world was still intact. Mine was not. I found a room in a traveler's inn, a place of anonymity where faces came and went. I paid with the few coins I had, my name given as another lie. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The core of my being, the part of me that could not kneel, recoiled from the small necessary falsehood. But survival was its own kind of truth. For 3 days, I waited. I stayed in the small dark room, listening. Uncertainty is a poison. It seeps into everything. On the 3rd evening, a girl who brought up meals, thin, quiet, with watchful eyes, lingered at the door. "You're her, aren't you?" she whispered. I said nothing. "The one who stood," she clarified. I still said nothing. My silence was its own answer. "They're all talking," she said, her voice dropping lower. "In the kitchens, in the markets. The Chancellor has sealed the palace. The High Council meets without end. And the Emperor, she hesitated. No one has seen him, not since that day. Some say he's taken ill. Some say the council has contained him. Others say he just walked away, that he gave it all up. She looked at me, her young face a mixture of terror and awe. Did he really do it? Did he really stand up? The question was simple. The truth was not. He did not stand up. He came down. He had crossed the distance. He had met me where I stood. He had done it once in private, a question. He had done it again in public, a declaration. Again. The word echoed in my mind. That night, I could not sleep. I stood by the window, looking out over the sleeping city. The inn was near the old aqueducts, and from here I could just see the highest spire of the Imperial Palace, a black needle against the star-dusted sky. The throne was empty. The Emperor was a ghost, and I was a story being told in kitchens and back alleys. I had believed in the system, in the integrity of the charter, in the power of a petition filed correctly. I believed that truth, written down and presented according to protocol, was the strongest thing in the world. I was wrong. The truth was not strong. It was simply true. It did not act. It only was. My refusal to kneel was not an act of strength. It was an act of inability. I could not perform the lie. That was my life. That was my nature. But the Emperor, his was an act of will. He had chosen to see. He had chosen to listen. And then he had chosen to break the single most important ritual of his reign. He had not fixed the injustice of the tax. He had shattered the tool used to sanctify all injustices. He had thrown a wrench into the gears. He had pulled the keystone from the arch. Why? Was it for me? Or was I just the excuse? The final, unbearable weight on a foundation he already knew was rotten? I did not know. I might never know. All I knew was the cold fact of my new reality. He had walked away, leaving me standing in the ruins of the world he had unmade. Alone. They did not hold me. Not after that. After the Emperor spoke his last decree and walked away from the throne, the world dissolved into noise. A collective gasp, 1,000 shuffling feet. The sharp, disbelieving cry of Lord Chancellor Valerius. Guards moved but without direction. They were pieces on a board whose rules had just been erased. In the chaos, a hand touched my elbow. It was one of the junior attendants, a young man named Elian, whose face I recognized from the archives. His expression was a mask of terror and something else. Awe. "This way," he whispered. His voice was a thread in a hurricane. He led me not back to my gilded room, but down a service corridor, through a maze of stone passages that smelled of dust and cold laundry. No one stopped us. No one seemed to see us. I was no longer a prisoner. I was a ghost, haunting the palace I had broken. We emerged into an alley slick with rain. The air was cold, real. He pushed a heavy cloak into my hands. "Go," he said. "There is a room waiting, 4th floor, above the baker's on Elm Street. The key is under the mat." I looked at him, at the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. Why? He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking past me at the palace walls as if they might crumble. "Because you stood," he said. "Someone had to." He turned and was gone, swallowed by the palace again. I was alone in the rain, free. A judgment had been passed, but not on me. A retraction had been made, but not by me. The Emperor had done what no ruler had ever done before. And then he had done it again. The room was small and bare, a cot, a table, a chair, a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was a cell, but the door was unlocked. The difference was everything. For 3 days, I did not leave. I sat in the chair and listened to the city. It was a low, constant hum of anxiety. Shouts in the street below, the hurried march of a patrol. Once the shattering of glass, the sounds of a system whose gears had seized. Elian came each evening after dark. He would bring bread, cheese, and news. He spoke in clipped, fearful sentences. "The capital is under conditional resolution," he said on the first night, a formal term for a city holding its breath. "Valerius has convened the High Council," he reported on the second. They issued a statement. "The emperor is unwell, in seclusion for his health." A lie. I knew it was a lie. The whole empire knew it was a lie. But it was a necessary one for them. A lie to paper over the crack in the foundation. "And him?" I asked. I did not need to say the name. Elian shook his head. "Gone. No one knows where. Some say he rode north alone. Some say he never left the palace, that he's a prisoner of the council. Uncertainty is a poison. Valerius was letting it seep into every street, every house. He was creating a vacuum he intended to fill. I was the other problem, the living evidence." "They are looking for you," Elian said, his voice barely audible. "Not officially, not yet, but they are looking." I just nodded. I had expected it. I was a loose thread in the official narrative they were weaving, a thread they would have to cut. On the 4th day, the decree came. Elian brought a printed copy, his hands shaking as he gave it to me. It was posted in every public square. I smoothed the cheap paper on the small wooden table. The language was Valerius's, formal, unyielding, full of words like continuity, stability, and sacrilege. It declared the emperor's final act, the abolition of the kneeling ritual, to be null and void, the product of a profound and temporary lapse in sovereign judgment. It was a masterpiece of political fiction. It painted the emperor as a madman and his decree as a symptom of his madness. The ritual was to be reinstated immediately. And then came the final paragraph, a direct address to me, though it did not use my name. It spoke of the source of the recent disruption. It stated that this individual was granted a final chance at clemency, a chance to prove her loyalty to the enduring principles of the empire. I was to present myself at the High Council chamber within 2 days. I was to perform the ritual of submission. I was to kneel. The paper felt heavy in my hands, the weight of their lie. They were trying to undo it all, to force the story back into its proper shape, to make me kneel and, in doing so, admit that I had been wrong, that the emperor had been wrong, that the truth was a sickness and the ritual was the cure. Elian was watching me, his face pale. "They will kill you if you don't," he said. It was not a threat. It was a fact, a simple, clear statement. "I know," I said. My crime had never been defiance. It was that I had made the emperor see the lie. And worse, I had made him speak a truth. Now, they needed me to take it back, to swallow the truth and perform the lie just once. But I had stood before the throne. The emperor himself had descended from that impossible distance to stand with me. He had shattered the ritual. How could I be the one to piece it back together? I spent that night staring at the brick wall outside my window. The city was quieter now, a tense, waiting silence. The choice was not a choice. It was a statement of fact. I could not kneel. It was a physical impossibility, like trying to breathe water. My body would not perform the lie. Not then and not now. To kneel now would be to say that the emperor's act meant nothing, that his disappearance was a footnote, that the truth he had finally acknowledged was just a lapse in judgment. It would be the greatest lie of all. I would not do it. That was my life, reduced to a single, simple refusal. I thought about the emperor, the man, not the symbol, the weariness in his eyes during our debates, the profound sadness when he realized we were both trapped, he by his office, I by my simple inability to pretend. He had found a way out, a radical, impossible way. He had chosen to stop being the emperor. He had walked away from the lie, and he had left me here to stand in his place. My part in the story should have been over. I was an archivist. My role was to document what happened, not to be what happened. But Valerius was trying to write a different ending, an ending where I knelt, the ritual was restored, and the crack was sealed. I folded the decree and set it on the table. It was a summons, a demand. For a moment I felt a flicker of what I had felt in the throne hall. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet, deep-seated wrongness. My liability was my own. I would not let them erase the record. There was a knock on the door. It was not Elian's soft, hesitant tap. It was 3 sharp, deliberate raps, the sound of purpose. My heart did not race. A strange calm settled over me. The waiting was over. The next part was beginning. I thought they had come for me. The guard, the council's men. I was ready. I would stand when they opened the door, and I would stand when they took me away. I walked to the door. I did not ask who it was. I simply turned the lock and pulled it open. It was not a soldier. It was a woman, old and cloaked in simple gray wool. Her face was a web of fine lines, her eyes a startling pale blue. They were eyes that had seen a great deal. She held a small sealed scroll in one hand. She looked at me, her gaze taking in the bare room, the summons on the table, and finally, my face. There was no pity in her expression, only assessment. "Lysandra Kyle," she said. It was not a question. "I bring a message." She held out the scroll. The seal was plain, dark wax, but I recognized the crest pressed into it. It was not the official seal of the empire, the one Valerius now wielded. It was the emperor's personal signet. The woman's pale eyes held mine. "He did not leave you to stand alone," she said. "He left you to stand first." The woman was gone. The door clicked shut with a soft final sound, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. Her words remained, hanging in the still air of my chamber. "He did not leave you to stand alone. He left you to stand first." I stood. My legs ached from a tension I hadn't realized I was holding. The scroll was heavy in my hands, a dense cylinder of parchment bound by a simple leather tie and sealed with the emperor's personal sigil. Not the great seal of the empire, the one used for decrees and official pronouncements. This was smaller, more personal, a mark I had seen only on the most private of his papers in the archives. To stand first. The phrase was a key turning in a lock I didn't know was there. I had seen my defiance as an end, a final, personal statement. I would stand, and Valerius would have me killed, and the story would be over. A small, stubborn footnote in the long history of the empire. But the emperor had not seen it that way. He had not seen my act as an ending. He had seen it as a beginning. The first, a precedent. The thought was a weight far greater than any threat of execution. The Lord Chancellor wanted to make me an example. The emperor, it seemed, wanted to do the same. They simply disagreed on what the lesson should be. My fingers trembled as I worked at the leather tie. It came away easily. The wax seal, stamped with the dragon in repose, was brittle. I pressed my thumb into it and it cracked, crumbling into dark red dust on the polished floor. The sound was quiet, but it felt like a sacrilege, a finality. I unrolled the scroll on the low table where my untouched meals were always placed. It was not a letter. It was not a decree. It was a copy, a perfect archivist's rendering of the original Imperial Charter, the foundational document of the Empire, signed by the first emperor over 900 years ago. I knew it by heart. I had studied the original, housed in the deepest vault of the archives, its ink faded to the color of rust, the parchment as fragile as a dead leaf. But this copy was different. The text was the same, outlining the rights of citizens, the responsibilities of the provinces, and the conditional authority of the throne. But in the margins, in the emperor's own sharp, precise script, were annotations. My eyes scanned the familiar articles of law. Then I saw it. Beside Article 4, the section detailing the process for a citizen to petition the throne, was a note. Source of ritual protocol? Check records, year 112. Reign of Emperor Tiberius II. The submission decree. My breath caught. I knew the submission decree. It was a minor historical footnote, a decree passed during a period of civil unrest. Tiberius II, a weak and paranoid ruler, had been terrified of assassins. He mandated that all who approached the throne must kneel, their heads bowed, to prove they were not a threat. It was meant as a temporary security measure. I scrambled to the bottom of the scroll, my eyes flying over the emperor's annotations. He had done the research himself. He had traced the history of the ritual. Submission decree never formally codified into imperial law. Maintained by precedent only. Revoked by Empress Rhea, year 141. Her revocation was misplaced. See Archive Index 7-, gamma.*, Archive Index 7-gamma. The Lost Annex. The repository for documents deemed inconvenient or politically troublesome by subsequent rulers. It was a ghost file. Most archivists believed it was a myth. The emperor had found it. He had found the truth. The kneeling was not law. It was not even a proper tradition. It was the lingering ghost of a forgotten tyrant's fear, a ritual whose legal revocation had been deliberately buried. For more than 700 years, every citizen, every noble, every petitioner had knelt before the throne. They had performed a lie of submission, born not of respect, but of paranoia, a ritual with no foundation in the charter. The entire imperial structure of the court, the very performance of power that Valerius was willing to kill to protect, was built on a mistake, a clerical error, a lie. And the emperor had known. When I stood before him, he had not seen a rebel. He had seen the living embodiment of the law he was sworn to uphold. He had seen the truth. Uncertainty is a poison. It had seeped into the foundations of my world for days. But this scroll was the antidote. It was a solid thing, a fact. I traced the lines of the charter with my finger. The emperor's plan was terrifying in its simplicity. He had not run. He had not abdicated in weakness. He had set the stage. He had descended from the throne. Twice, he had shattered the ritual. He had abolished it through a decree. And when Valerius voided that decree, declaring it the act of an unwell mind, the emperor had anticipated that too. He knew Valerius would try to force the ritual back into place. He knew the Lord Chancellor would use me as the tool. He did not leave me a sword or an army. He did not leave me a promise of rescue. He left me something infinitely more powerful. He left me the law. He left me the truth, written on parchment, signed by the founder of his own dynasty. Valerius was defending a lie with the threat of death. The emperor had armed me with the truth. I stood up and walked to the window, the scroll left open on the table. The palace grounds were quiet. The ultimatum from Valerius gave me 2 days, 48 hours until I was to be brought before the throne again. 48 hours to choose between kneeling and dying. But there was a third option now. It had always been there, but I hadn't been able to see it. I could stand, not just for myself, not as a simple act of personal refusal. I could stand and I could speak. I could cite the Imperial Charter. I could expose the submission decree for what it was. I could reveal the lost revocation of Empress Rhea. I would not be a martyr breaking a sacred tradition. I would be a citizen upholding the oldest law in the empire. He left you to stand first. I was to be the first citizen to stand before the throne, not in defiance of the law, but in defense of it. The first to demand that the empire hold itself to its own charter. The emperor had stepped away from the throne, leaving a vacuum. He was giving me the chance to prove that the law was more powerful than the man who sat on the throne. That the charter was the foundation, not the ritual. It was a judgment, not my judgment. His, a judgment on the entire system. And he had made me the arbiter. The weight of it settled on my shoulders. It was cold and immense. This was no longer about my life. My refusal to kneel had been a private matter of conscience that became a public spectacle. Now, it was a matter of constitutional crisis. If I did this, I was throwing a wrench into the gears of the entire imperial machine. It would not just be my life at stake, but the stability of the empire itself. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of an archivist. Hands that handled old paper, that traced faded ink. They were not the hands of a revolutionary. But the emperor had not asked for a revolutionary. He had asked for an archivist, one who believed in the truth of the written record. I walked back to the table. I rolled the charter up again, slowly, carefully. The annotations were a map. The path was clear. It was a path that led directly back to the throne hall, back to the empty space where I had stood before. Valerius had given me a choice: kneel or die, a lie or an end. The emperor had given me a different one: stand and speak the truth, and see if the foundation of the empire was strong enough to bear it. The scroll was cool against my skin. It was made of archival vellum, a material I knew better than I knew my own reflection. It felt ancient and true. The seal had been the emperor's personal signet, not the grand ceremonial stamp of the imperial office, but the small, private one he used for his own correspondence. The message inside was not a command. It was not a plea. It was a citation, a reference to a document buried deep within the first imperial charter. Section 4, paragraph 12, subclause C. A provision I had never seen, because it was sealed under the highest classification of state secret, accessible only to the reigning emperor and the Lord Chancellor. The ritual of submission, hereafter kneeling, shall be a conditional resolution offered to those found liable in a court of imperial judgment. It shall not be a prerequisite for petition, address, or presence before the throne. The law was clear. It had always been clear. For 500 years, the ritual had been a lie. Not just a symbolic lie, the kind I had refused to perform, a legal one, a wrench thrown into the very gears of imperial precedent. The emperor had not just abandoned the throne, he had armed me with the truth of it, a truth that could dismantle the entire structure of power Lord Valerius now claimed. My ultimatum was to kneel or be executed, but an execution for upholding the original charter was not an execution. It was murder, and Valerius, a man obsessed with protocol and the letter of the law, was now acting in direct violation of it. Uncertainty is a poison, but this was an antidote. I did not feel brave. I felt the quiet, cold certainty of a librarian who has found the correct reference, the satisfaction of a fact slotting perfectly into place. I stood. The guards came at dawn. Their footsteps were heavy in the silent corridor, the sound I had been waiting for. There were 4 of them, their armor polished to a mirror sheen, their faces impassive. They did not speak. They did not need to. I held the scroll in my hand. It was the only thing I took with me. The walk was the same one I had taken twice before, through the gilded halls, past tapestries depicting battles and coronations, past windows that looked out onto a city that had no idea what was happening within the palace walls. The distance felt greater this time. The silence was heavier. Before, I had been a petitioner, then a prisoner. I did not know what I was now. The doors to the throne hall were open, waiting. The room was full. The entire court stood assembled, a gallery of silks and jewels, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and rigid formality. They were a captive audience for a judgment that had already been rendered. Lord Chancellor Valerius stood on the dais, not on the throne. Even he did not dare. That's sacrilege. Not yet. He stood just before it, one step down, appropriating its power, bathing in its reflected glory. He had become the center of the room, the new sun around which all these lesser bodies were forced to orbit. He watched me walk the long path across the marble floor. Every footstep echoed, a lonely, deliberate sound, the sound of a single solid object moving through a vacuum. I stopped where I had stopped before, in the designated space for petitioners, for the condemned. The vast, empty distance between us was a chasm. Valerius's voice was smooth, resonant with authority. It carried through the hall without effort. Lysandra Kyle, you have been given a final chance to retract your defiance, a final opportunity to show fealty and accept the grace of the Imperial office. He was the Imperial office now. He spoke as if the Emperor had never existed. The ritual is simple, he continued, his eyes cold. It has been the foundation of order for centuries. Perform it. Kneel. The word hung in the air. A command, a threat. The entire court held its breath. This was the moment, the final act of the play he had staged. My submission or my death. I did not look at him. I looked at the empty throne, at the space where the Emperor had stood, where he had stood and then descended again. And I just stood there. You were given a conditional resolution, Valerius said, his voice tightening. Your refusal to accept it is a final act of treason. The sentence is absolute. The guards at the door shifted their weight. A ripple of fear went through the court. The law is absolute, I said. My own voice sounded small in the oppressive space, but it was clear. Valerius gave a slight condescending smile. Indeed, and the law demands your submission or your life. No, I said. It was not an argument. It was a correction. It does not. I held up the scroll. My hand was steady. This is a message from the Emperor. I announced. The words caused a stir, a wave of murmurs that Valerius silenced with a single, sharp glare. A forged sentiment from a man who has proven himself unwell, he countered smoothly. Inadmissible. It is not a sentiment, I replied, my voice gaining strength. It is a legal citation from the first Imperial Charter. Section 4, paragraph 12, subclause C. A flicker of something in Valerius's eyes. Not fear, not yet. Annoyance, the irritation of a small, unexpected snag in a perfectly woven tapestry. He knew the Charter better than anyone. He must have known the passage. He just never believed anyone else would. The clause states, I continued, my voice the voice of an archivist reading a record, that the ritual of submission is a conditional resolution offered after a judgment of liability. It is not and has never been a prerequisite for petition. To demand it as such is an illegal act. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer passive, it was active, sharp, a blade being honed. The court was not looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking from me to Valerius. They were weighing the truth. For 500 years, I said, letting the scroll unroll slightly in my hand. Every person who has knelt in this hall before speaking has been compelled to perform an act not required by the foundational laws of this empire. The ritual itself, as it is practiced, is a lie. There it was, the word, the one that started all of this. Lie. Valerius's face was a mask of fury, but his voice remained dangerously calm. You stand here, a common archivist, and lecture me on the Charter, on the nature of precedent? I stand here and state what is written, I said. The precedent is illegal. The Emperor knew it. And now, so do you. He was trapped. I could see it. The truth was a cage he had not anticipated. To execute me now would be to admit that I was right. He would not be a chancellor preserving order. He would be a tyrant, murdering a citizen for upholding the empire's most sacred text. He had built his entire career on the unassailable sanctity of protocol, and I had just shown him that his most cherished protocol was a violation of the ultimate law. He could not command me to kneel. Not anymore. He could not command my execution. Not without making himself a traitor to the Charter. The distance between us was no longer empty space. It was filled with the terrible, unmoving weight of the law. He just stared at me, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. The architect of the system undone by its own blueprint. He had expected me to fight him on the grounds of morality, a battle he knew how to win. But I was an archivist. I did not fight with morals, I fought with facts. And the fact was, I had the right to stand. I always had. The silence was a judgment. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had met my first refusal to kneel. That had been the silence of shock, of a ritual broken. This was the silence of a foundation cracking. It was the sound of hundreds of minds processing a truth that invalidated a lifetime of belief. Lord Chancellor Valerius stood frozen. The words I had spoken, the citation, the statute, the name of the tyrant who had invented the kneeling, hung in the air between us. They were a weight. He was the high priest of Imperial protocol, and I had just revealed that his most sacred ritual was not a cornerstone of the empire. It was a lie. His face, a mask of rigid certainty moments before, was now just a face, a man's face. The skin was stretched tight over his jaw. His eyes, fixed on the data slate in my hand, held not anger, but a deep, burning offense. The kind of offense a man feels when the world he has meticulously ordered is revealed to be built on sand. "A forgery," he said. His voice was thin, stripped of its resonant authority. The words did not land. They were a desperate grasp for the power that was bleeding out of him on the throne hall floor. "It is from the Imperial archives, Lord Chancellor," I said. My own voice was steady. I was an archivist. This was my ground. "From the unindexed codices of the Second Dynasty. The statute number is clear. The Emperor's seal is on the message." I did not need to say which emperor. We all knew. "The Emperor is unwell," Valerius snapped, his voice gaining a frantic edge. "His mind is compromised. This is a symptom of his affliction. A fabrication meant to sow chaos." But the lie was too thin now. The court was not a single entity anymore. It was a collection of individuals. I could see them, the ministers and legates, the generals and nobles. Their eyes flickered from me to Valerius, then back again. They were calculating. Uncertainty is a poison to a system built on absolute obedience, and the Emperor had just injected a lethal dose. I did not argue. I simply stood. That was the truth of it. I stood there, holding the record. The law was the law. A fact did not become less true simply because a powerful man wished it so. The first crack in his authority came not from me, but from the side. General Rian, commander of the First Legion, a man whose entire life was service and the law of the Empire. He took one precise step forward. It was not a grand gesture, but in that hall, it was an earthquake. "Lord Chancellor," Ryan's voice was gravel worn smooth by decades of command. "The claim is a grave one. The document must be verified." It was not a question. Valerius turned his head slowly, a mechanical motion. "General, this is a matter of state security, not military protocol." "The law is the foundation of all protocol, my lord," Ryan answered, his tone unyielding. "If the archivist's claim is true, then her refusal to kneel was not an act of sacrilege. It was an act of legal fidelity." The words echoed. Legal fidelity. He had given my defiance a name Valerius could not easily condemn. He had taken my personal inability to lie and framed it in the only language the court truly understood, the language of legitimate power. I did not kneel because the law, the true law, said I did not have to. I was no longer a heretic. I was a citizen upholding the charter. Valerius saw it. He saw the shift in the room, the wavering loyalty, the dawning realization in the eyes of the other ministers that their own power was derived from the same charter I now held. If he could ignore this part of it, what other parts could be ignored? Their titles? Their lands? His power was never his own. It was a performance, and the audience was beginning to question the script. "This is an absurdity," he hissed, but the conviction was gone. He was speaking to himself. "A trick? Then it will be an easy one to expose." Another voice said, "It was Minister Aris, the keeper of the Imperial treasury, a man known for his caution. Let the jurists examine the citation. Let them consult the archives. The truth will be known." The truth. The word hung there. Valerius was trapped. To deny the jurists their duty would be to admit his authority superseded the law itself, an act of tyranny far more explicit than anything the emperor had done. To allow the verification would be to admit his own power was conditional. He stared at me, and for a moment, the vast distance of the throne hall collapsed. I saw the pure, undiluted hatred in his eyes. I had not just defied him, I had made him small. I had shown everyone that the iron framework of ritual he commanded was hollow. He could not have me executed. Not now. To kill the person who had just upheld the empire's founding law would make him a murderer in the eyes of the very system he claimed to protect. Again, the emperor had moved. Again, he had done what no one expected. He had not fought Valerius with a sword. He had handed me a shield made of truth. The guards who escorted me from the hall were different. Their movements were hesitant. They kept their distance. I was no longer a condemned prisoner on her final walk. I was something else, a liability, a symbol, a question that had not yet been answered. They did not take me back to the cold cell. I was led through corridors I had never seen, all polished marble and silent tapestries, to a suite of rooms in the western wing of the palace. The air was warm. The furniture was soft. A tray of food, real food, not prison rations, sat on a low table. It was a gilded cage, but the door was not barred. It was simply closed. I stood in the center of the plush carpet and felt the silence settle around me. It was heavier than the silence of the throne hall. Here, it was the silence of limbo. My judgment had been stayed. My life, for the moment, was not forfeit. But I had not won. I had only deepened the crisis. The throne was still empty. The Lord Chancellor's authority was fractured, but he was not gone. The empire was a body with two heads, both claiming to speak for it. I walked to the window. It overlooked the central palace courtyard. Below, I could see messengers scurrying, knots of officials talking in hushed, urgent tones. The gears of the great machine, which had been grinding to a halt, were now spinning wildly with no one in control. The emperor had done this. He had thrown a wrench made of pure, unassailable law into the mechanism of a lie. He had forced a choice upon the court, upon the whole empire. Did they serve the ritual, or did they serve the truth? He had given me the means to survive, but he had also made me the fulcrum of the entire conflict. Every faction, every ambitious minister and calculating general would now see me not as a person, but as a piece in the game. A pawn to be captured, or a queen to be used? I thought of his message, the simple citation. It was an archivist's weapon, a quiet, devastating fact. He knew me. He knew I would not use a sword or an impassioned speech. He knew I would simply present the record. He had trusted me to stand. And I had. Now I had to keep standing in this quiet room while the storm I had unleashed raged outside my door. The weight of what came next was a physical presence. It was the price of truth. It was a burden far heavier than kneeling could ever have been. The words hung in the air, not like a shout, but like dust motes caught in a sunbeam, suddenly visible, suddenly everywhere. Silence. It was a different kind of silence than before, not the oppressive ritual weight of the throne hall. This was a vacuum, a space where a foundation had been and now was not. I stood on the dais, the ancient leather-bound charter held in my hands. It felt heavier than stone. Every eye in the hall was a physical weight. They were not all on me now. They flickered, from me to the charter, to the face of Lord Chancellor Valerius. Back and forth, 1,000 silent judgments being weighed. His face was a marvel of control. The initial shock had been wiped clean, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He saw what I saw. He saw the shifting loyalties, the calculations happening behind the eyes of generals and ministers. He saw the crack I had hammered into the base of his power, and he tried to seal it with the only tool he had left, the lie. "A forgery," he said. His voice was too loud in the stillness. It cracked like a whip, but the sound was thin, brittle. A desperate fabrication from a condemned traitor in league with an absent and unwell sovereign. He pointed a trembling finger at me. She has committed the highest sacrilege. She has not only defied the ritual, she has sought to poison the very roots of our history with this document. The word was a dismissal, an attempt to shrink the Imperial Charter into a mere scrap of paper. It did not work. I was an archivist. My life had been spent with documents. I knew their weight, their texture, the truth of them, and so did others. In the front rows, I saw the faces of the imperial historian and the keepers of the law libraries. They stared at the charter in my hands with a kind of terrified reverence. They knew. "Seize her," Valerius commanded, his voice rising. "Seize the traitor and the forgery she holds. The sentence stands. The retraction was not made. Her liability is absolute." A ripple went through the Praetorian Guard. They were sworn to him, their commander in the emperor's absence. They took a step forward, 2 steps. Their armor groaned in the quiet. And then they stopped. They did not look at me. They looked at their commander, General Aris, who stood just to the right of the Chancellor's position. Aris was a man carved from granite, his face a roadmap of old campaigns. He had not moved. He had not drawn his sword. His eyes were fixed on the charter in my hands. He was a man of the law, the military law. An order was an order, but the Imperial Charter was the law that created the orders. It was the source code for the entire system, and I just stood there. I held the truth, the physical fact of it. Valerius's face purpled. "General, I gave you a command." General Aris turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. He did not look at Valerius. He looked past him, toward the empty throne. The distance between the general and the chancellor suddenly seemed vast, a canyon of doubt. "Lord Chancellor," Aris said, his voice a low rumble, "the document she holds, it bears the first emperor's seal. It must be verified. It was not a refusal. It was a conditional resolution, a delay. But in that moment, it was everything. A wrench thrown into the gears of my own execution." "Verified?" Valerius spat the word. "It is a lie, a prop in a madwoman's theater. I am the voice of the throne. My word is the verification." "No," I said. My own voice was quiet, but it cut through his. "It is not." I held the charter out, not to him, to the court, to anyone who would look. "The law is the verification," I said. The emperor understood that. The ritual was a lie. He could not sit on a throne supported by a lie, so he stood. He stood, and he walked away from it. I looked at Valerius. You could not wait to climb onto it. Something broke then, not with a sound, but with a movement. From the assembled ministers, a woman stepped forward. Duchess Eleonora, the Minister of State, an old, shrewd politician who had survived 3 emperors. Her face was grim. "The general is correct, Lord Chancellor," she said, her tone measured, devoid of challenge but full of unyielding authority. "Uncertainty is a poison. The charter must be authenticated by the Council of Jurists. The woman, Lysandra Kyle, must be held in secure custody until a ruling is made. She was not saving me. She was containing the crisis. I was no longer a person. I was a constitutional problem, a piece of evidence to be sequestered." Valerius stared at her, then at General Aris. He saw the stone in their faces. He saw the senators and ministers behind them, their expressions closed, their positions suddenly terribly neutral. He had lost them. He had demanded they kneel before his authority, and in the face of the truth, they simply stood. For a moment, I thought he would scream, that he would order the guards loyal only to his person to charge, to start the bloodshed right there. But he was a creature of the system. He understood its pressure points. He saw that the pressure was no longer his to command. He drew himself up, a mockery of imperial dignity. "Very well," he said, the words clipped. "Let the jurists see the forgery. Let them confirm the depths of this treason. But when they do, the judgment will be carried out by my authority." He turned, his crimson robes swirling, and strode from the hall. He did not look back. It was not a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal. He was going to fight this, not with swords in the throne hall, but with whispers in the palace corridors. The tension did not leave with him. It simply changed its shape. General Aris finally looked at me. His expression was impossible to read. It was not kindness. It was not anger. It was the look a man gives a complex weapon he has just been forced to disarm. "Archivist Kyle," he said, the title feeling strange and formal. "You will come with me." 2 of his guards flanked me. They did not touch me. They simply walked beside me as I descended from the dais, the charter still in my hands. The assembled court parted before us, their faces a blur of fear, curiosity, and calculation. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft tread of my own shoes on the marble floor and the rhythmic clang of the guards' armor. They did not take me to a cell. The room was in the minister's wing of the palace. It was furnished with a simple bed, a desk, and a chair, a gilded cage just like before. But this time was different. Before, I was the emperor's guest, a subject of his curiosity. Now I was a prisoner of the state he had left behind. A jurist, a severe-looking man with ink-stained fingers, came to take the charter. He handled it with the delicacy of a priest handling a holy relic. He did not speak to me. He only took the artifact and left. I was alone again. I walked to the window. It overlooked a quiet, manicured courtyard. The world outside the glass was still, orderly. But I knew it was not. I had read the truth aloud in the heart of the empire, and now the entire imperial structure was shuddering. The emperor had not given me a shield. He had not given me a sword. He had given me a single, undeniable fact. A truth so heavy it had broken the ritual. So heavy it had forced a general to question an order. So heavy it had emptied the throne. He had known. He had known Valerius would seize power. He had known I would be brought back. He had counted on me to do the one thing I could not help but do: to stand and to speak the truth. This was his endgame. Not to save me, not to save himself. It was to force the empire to look at the lie it was built upon. He had stepped off the throne, and then he had sent me back to knock it over. They did not take me to a cell. I had expected the cold stone of the lower levels, the damp chill that lived in the palace's forgotten corners. I had prepared myself for it. But the 2 imperial guards who flanked me turned away from the descending stairs. Their posture had changed. Before, they were executioners waiting for a signal. Now they were men guarding a fragile, explosive artifact. The walk was long. Our footsteps were the only sound in the marble corridors. The courtiers and functionaries who had filled these halls before had vanished, melted back into the shadows of the palace. They left behind a silence that was different now. Not the oppressive silence of ritual, but the hollow silence of a vacuum. The silence of a world holding its breath. One of the guards, the one on my left, kept his eyes forward. The other sometimes glanced at me. Not with malice, not anymore. With a kind of fearful curiosity. I was no longer a traitor to be disposed of. I was something else. A constitutional problem. That was the general's term. A problem to be stored, not solved, not yet. The room they brought me to was in the scholars' wing, a part of the palace I had only ever seen from a distance. It was not a cell. It was a finely appointed suite of rooms meant for a visiting dignitary or a favored academic. There was a bed with linen so soft they felt like water, a desk of polished ironwood, a window that looked out onto a quiet, manicured garden walled in by high stone, a beautiful cage. A guard was posted outside my door. He was a statue. Food appeared on a small table in the antechamber, brought by servants who moved like ghosts and would not meet my eye. For the first day, there was only silence. I did not sleep. I sat in a high-backed chair and I waited. The entire apparatus of the empire was focused on a single task, verifying my claim. Somewhere deep in the Imperial archives, a team of my former colleagues would be poring over the founding charter. They would be testing the ink, the parchment, the seal. They would be comparing the script to known exemplars from the first emperor's hand. They were looking for a flaw, a forgery, a way out. They were looking for a way to make my truth into a lie. But the emperor had not given me a lie. He had given me a weapon forged from the empire's own foundation. He had known they would find it to be real. He had counted on it. This was his plan, not just to save me, but to force a reckoning. He had stood, he had descended, he had walked away, and then, from a distance, he had spoken again, through me. On the second day, I had a visitor. It was not Lord Chancellor Valerius. I knew I would not see him again for some time. His power was built on the unshakable certainty of protocol. I had taken that certainty and shattered it on the floor of the throne hall. He was wounded, politically if not physically, and would be coiled in the dark, plotting. It was not the general either. He was waiting for the verification. My visitor was a man named Theron, a senior scribe from the archives. We were not friends, merely colleagues who had shared the same quiet workspaces for years. He was a timid man, a man who believed in rules above all else. He entered the room and the guard closed the door behind him, leaving us in that strange, suspended privacy. He carried a small wooden box. My things. A few spare sets of clothes, a book of legal theory, a worn copy of the provincial histories I favored, the mundane artifacts of a life I no longer had. He set the box on the table. He would not look at me. The general commanded it, he said, his voice a low murmur. He said, "You should have your effects." "Thank you, Theron." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. The silence stretched. It was the familiar silence of the archives, but now it felt charged with unspoken questions. Finally he spoke again, barely a whisper. "Why, Lysandra?" It was not an accusation. It was a genuine, terrified question. He was not asking why I had defied the Chancellor. He was asking why I had broken the world. I looked at my hands, resting in my lap. They were the hands of a scholar, stained with a little ink at the cuticles, not the hands of a revolutionary. I was summoned to retract a truth, I said. To do that, I was expected to kneel. The kneeling was part of the retraction. It was the first part of the lie. He flinched at the word lie. It was not a word one used when speaking of imperial ritual. I just couldn't, I finished. It was the simplest way to explain it. It was the only way. I could not perform the lie with my body. Theron finally looked up at me. His face was pale. In his eyes, I saw the same crack I had seen in the general's composure, the hairline fracture in the ice. He had spent his life cataloging the Empire's laws, its decrees, its history. He, more than most, understood what it meant if the central ritual of our time was built on nothing. "They are in the lower vaults," he said, his voice dropping even lower, as if the walls themselves were listening. "The curators. They've been there since yesterday. No one is allowed in or out. The general has sealed the entire level." He was telling me that my claim was being taken seriously. He was telling me that the system was working even as it tore itself apart. "Uncertainty is a poison, Lysandra," he whispered. "It's spreading through the palace. People don't know what to believe, who to follow." "They should follow the law," I said. He gave a short, bitter laugh that died in his throat. "Which one? The law we have lived by for 500 years, or the one you found on a forgotten piece of parchment?" He did not wait for an answer. He bowed, a shallow, jerky motion, and left. The general came on the third day. He entered without ceremony. The door opened, he stepped inside, and it closed behind him. He wore no formal regalia, just the simple, dark uniform of his office. He stood in the center of the room, his presence seeming to shrink the space around him. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles. "The curators have completed their work," he said. No preamble, no pleasantries. "They presented their findings to me an hour ago." I waited. My heart was a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. "The founding charter is authentic," he stated. "It was a fact, delivered like a hammer blow. The seal is unbroken. The script is a perfect match. The language is unambiguous." He took a step closer. The distance between us was shrinking. The emperor had closed that distance once. Now his general was doing it. "Article 9, Section 4, the general recited, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Submission to imperial law shall be demonstrated by sworn oath and recorded signature. No other physical display of fealty shall be held as a legal requirement. There is no mention of kneeling, not there, not anywhere." He stopped. He stood before my chair. For the first time, we were at eye level. "It was a lie," I said, the words tasting of rust and relief. "It was a precedent," he corrected, his voice sharp, "set by the second emperor, a precedent that became tradition, a tradition that became ritual, and a ritual that, for 5 centuries, was mistaken for law." His gaze was intense, searching. "You were right. Lord Chancellor Valerius, in his demand that you kneel as a condition of justice, was acting outside the bounds of the Charter. He was enforcing a lie. The confirmation did not feel like a victory. It felt like a weight settling. The truth was now official, a documented fact, and a documented fact demanded action. "So what happens now?" I asked. A muscle worked in the general's jaw. "That is the question, Archivist Kale. The Emperor is gone. The throne is empty. Lord Chancellor Valerius has been publicly discredited, but he still commands the loyalty of the old guard. The court is fractured into a dozen pieces. And you—" He looked at me, and his expression was one of profound, weary frustration. "You are the stone that broke the gears of the empire. You are no longer a traitor. You are no longer a constitutional problem. You are a fact, a truth made flesh. And I do not know what to do with you." He was the most powerful man in the empire, the commander of all its legions, and he was admitting he was lost. "I don't want power," I said quietly. It was essential that he understand this. "I never did. I am an archivist." "You are a symbol," he countered, "and symbols have a power all their own." He turned and walked to the window, looking out at the walled garden. Valerius wants you dead. There are factions that would see you raised up as a prophet, others who believe you are the emperor's chosen successor. They are all wrong. They don't see you at all. They only see what you represent. He turned back to me. I am a soldier, archivist. I believe in order, in the law. You have shown me that the law and our order are not the same thing. So I ask you again, because your answer matters more than you can possibly comprehend. What happens now? He was not asking for my command. He was asking for my intent. He needed to know if the woman who had broken the world intended to try and remake it. I thought of my life in the archives, the quiet satisfaction of a corrected entry, the simple integrity of a true record. The truth is the truth, General, I said. It must be entered into the record. It must be made public. The lie must end. He stared at me for a long time. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but recognition. He saw that I was not an opportunist. I was simply an archivist demanding the catalog be corrected. It did not make me any less of a problem for him. It just changed the nature of the problem. Very well, he said, his voice low and final. He left me there in the gilded cage. But the cage was different now. The walls felt thinner. The world outside was pressing in. The silence that followed his departure was heavier than any that had come before. It was the silence of a question that had been answered, only to reveal a dozen more, each one more dangerous than the last.